Welcome back, everyone. So the third and final lecture on neural networks today. One of the big disadvantages of neural networks over the previous algorithms that we've learned is that they take a long, long time to train compared to other classification algorithms that we've studied. For the first part of this lecture, I'm going to talk a little bit about the lore of backprop, some of the heuristics that people use for two things: to make gradient descent faster and to make it less likely to overfit your data. I do want to emphasize that when you're actually coding a neural network yourself, because neural networks are complicated and backprop is complicated, you really want to make sure you get a basic working implementation first of just vanilla backprop, and then start experimenting with all of these speed-ups and ways to prevent overfitting. But having said that, here are some of the ways to try to speed up backprop. So I already talked about one of them at the end of last lecture. I talked about the vanishing gradient problem and ways to mitigate it, and that certainly helps speed up training. So that's one example. Another one is understanding the difference between stochastic and batch gradient descent and when to use each one. Having said that, there's a lot of cases where stochastic gradient descent is the more natural choice, and that's generally when you have a really large data set. Stochastic gradient descent usually is faster than batch gradient descent. And this is most likely to be true when you have data sets that essentially have a lot of redundant data. So what do I mean by that? Like, think about digit recognition. Since homework 1, you've been using classifiers to recognize digits, and suppose you have a billion handwritten zeros, a billion handwritten ones, a billion handwritten twos. Well, there's probably a lot of redundancy there, because there's only so many ways to write a 0 or to write a 2. Therefore, if you only train on 1,000,000 rather than 1,000,000,000, you'll probably do just as well. Maybe if you train on 1,000, you'll do just as well. It depends. But you don't necessarily know when you start how long you have to train before you'll have something that looks like convergence or something that has a good success rate on the test data. So by using stochastic gradient descent, if there's a lot of redundancy in your data, then stochastic gradient descent will make use of that redundancy. It'll keep learning the same thing over and over again, and therefore often get to a good classifier much sooner than batch gradient descent does. So, one thing I would direct you to, if you're really interested in knowing as much as possible about neural networks, is there's a paper called Efficient Backprop by Jan LeCun and co-authors, which I've linked from the web page, so that for the class web page for this lecture, so you can very conveniently find it. They give lots of different advice, some of which I'll repeat today. This is a figure from their paper where they show you what happens stochastic versus batch gradient descent on a very simple example. Simple meaning literally just one neuron. And so this neuron has 3 weights. 2 of them, there's only 2 inputs. So 2 of the weights are making a linear combination of those inputs, and then omega 2 here is a bias term that's added at the end. The plots that you see here, there is a plot in the middle which shows us batch gradient descent and how it operates. And there's one on the right that shows us stochastic gradient descent with exactly the same training set. The curve that's being plotted there is the cost function. Now, you might say, well, there are 3 parameters, but that's only a 2-dimensional plot. Yeah, so what they did is they didn't plot the bias term. We are still learning the bias term. We are actually searching through a three-dimensional space, but we're only showing you two of the dimensions of the weight space. That's enough to see what's going on. So just to be clear, the horizontal axis in both of these figures is the weight omega 0, and the vertical axis is the weight omega 1. So that's these two weights here. And what we see is the path that gradient descent takes as we do either batch or stochastic gradient descent. So on the left, we start somewhere over here, and the first iteration of batch gradient descent takes us to there, and then the second iteration takes us from here to here, and you'll see that the path starts to zigzag back and forth. And by the way, it's in red and blue just so you can tell the iterations apart. A red iteration, blue iteration, red iteration, blue iteration. On the right, we see the path that stochastic gradient descent takes. Now remember, stochastic gradient descent is only descending on one training point at a time. And so iteration kind of has a different meaning here. In order to draw the obvious parallel between batch and stochastic gradient descent, neural net researchers will talk about an epoch of training. An epoch essentially presents every training point once. So if you have 1,000 training points, you're doing 1,000 steps of stochastic gradient descent, and each point gets processed exactly once. And one epoch is essentially like parallel or equivalent to one iteration of batch gradient descent, because in batch gradient descent, you're looking at all the points at the same time. So, but the analogy is not precise. Obviously, they behave quite differently. And what you see here, so this red jiggle, that is the first epoch. That is presenting every training point once. And then this blue wiggle is, now we go through all of the training points a second time, and so on. And you'll notice that the very first time we go through all of the training points, we make a lot more progress towards the true minimum than we do when we do batch gradient descent here. And my interpretation of this is that what's happening is that there's a lot of redundant information here in this data, and by iterating on each data point separately, we're making faster progress by using that, taking advantage of that redundancy in the data. Now, I want to say again, with this idea of an epoch, training a neural network usually takes several to many epochs. But what if you have a really huge set? Well, if the sample is really big, like if you have 1 billion digits to train on, then you have so much redundant information in your set, you might not even need to go through all of the data. Maybe after looking at the first 10 million digits, you're already very well trained. So sometimes you don't even have to complete one full epoch of stochastic gradient descent if you have a huge, huge, huge amount of data. Any questions about that? Yeah. Well, an epoch of batch gradient descent is just one iteration, but one iteration has to look at every training point. So what the two have in common, batch and stochastic gradient descent, is that an epoch looks at every training point once. Yeah. Yes, so an epoch, you should think of it as sampling without replacement, exactly. Or I'd like to think of it as shuffling the deck of cards and going through the whole deck once. Yeah?
Why do we get so much
Why do we get so much further with stochastic gradient descent than with batch gradient descent? Well, in this particular example, one of the reasons is that we started in a place where the gradient just wasn't very good, and so we didn't really make as much progress in the batch gradient descent. Whereas when we do stochastic, the first few data points we look at get us to a place where the gradient is pointing in a different direction, that is more working towards the center of the, the minimum of the cost function than batch gradient descent was. So to some degree, it's catching better gradients as you go. Question there? Yeah, once it gets into the valley, it still looks like it's progressing more quickly. And honestly, I cannot tell from the paper whether or not this is related to, for instance, the step size they chose. I'm not sure that this is a real phenomenon once you get into the valley. I would say, though, that when you're doing a real neural network, one that's not just one neuron, your valley is not going to look just like elliptical. It's going to be much more complicated. And so the first step, epoch here, is I think the one that's most like the first 1,000 epochs are going to be in a large-scale neural network. So keep that in mind. At the end here, once you've found your way into the valley, is almost it's only a tiny amount of the total running time in a real simulation. Yeah? Can we say the loss curve is what? Oh, well, I mean, from my point of view, we can see where the minimum is, and it's clear that batch gradient descent has not yet converged. Stochastic gradient descent at the end is getting close, but it still has error. What it means to converge is kind of a tricky enough topic that we're not really going to explore it this semester. But batch definitely has not converged in any way that we would be comfortable with, because it's not even close to the center of that ellipse. I want to briefly talk about normalizing the data, and this is something you've been doing all semester long from time to time. But let me say a few words about it. Just a reminder what we mean when we talk about normalizing the data. First of all, we center each feature so that its mean is 0. And then scale each feature so that the variances of all the features are the same. Usually, we pick a variance around 1. Now, normalizing, you can think of it as a cheap version of whitening. You know, in whitening, we actually compute all the cross correlations, all the covariances between different features. Normalizing, we do not look at all at the interactions between features. We treat each feature independently. So it's cheaper, but a little less powerful. Nevertheless, it can be really helpful, and it's some algorithms it's more helpful than others. So like Gaussian discriminant analysis is an example of an algorithm we've learned where normalizing isn't really going to make a difference because the algorithm automatically scales itself to the data. On the other hand, neural networks are very sensitive to differences in the scale between features. If you have one feature that's usually between 0 and 1, and another feature that's between 0 and 1,000,000, the feature that's between 0 and 1,000,000 is liable to overpower your neurons relative to the small features and mess things up. So the small numbers don't have a chance to have an influence. We do find that normalizing the data helps with neural networks in practice for several different reasons. Actually, let me just show you a sketch of what this means. So if you start with the data on the left, after it's centered, it looks like it here in the middle. After you normalize it, it looks here on the right. You'll notice it's still oblong. We haven't turned it into a circular shape because we're not looking at covariances. But at least each feature has roughly the same scale. They all have a variance of 1. And there's several reasons why this helps. So first of all, remember that the varieties we're using, whether they be sigmoids or ReLUs, the nonlinear region is in the center, meaning the input is close to 0, that's where the nonlinearity happens. And that's what gives neural networks power, is that nonlinearity. So it's good to have the inputs to your units hovering around 0, because that's where all the power is. So having the features themselves have a mean of 0 helps to get the neurons in the right operating range. Normalizing then, scaling them, essentially has a similar effect where, remember, you don't want to overpower a neuron by putting too big an input into it, because then you move it out into the flat spot of the sigmoid where gradient descent doesn't work very well. So we want to have data at the right size, and we want to have all the different features equally influential. Now, one thing that's worth understanding about features of different scales, if you have features of different scales, then your cost function might wind up looking more oblong. Like here you can see that these are isocontours of a cost function. We want to minimize that cost function. And like this is a very simple example. A neural network would look a lot more complicated than that. But the point is that the isocontours are very oblong, very eccentric. One direction is much longer than the other. When that happens, gradient descent tends to not work as well. Gradient descent loves circular isocontours, and it hates oblong isocontours. Because oblong isocontours make it zigzag around and have difficulty finding the center. So normalization is one way to try to make these isocontours a little bit more circular so that you get to the center faster when you do gradient descent. Any questions about that? Yeah. Rotating your data certainly has a significant effect, whether it helps or hurts. It will depend a lot on the application. It's not done very often because rotating your data is expensive, although if the feature space is small, you should probably try it. If the feature space is big, maybe not. Yeah. It's not that having circular isocontours makes it easier to calculate the gradient. It's that if you have circular isocontours, and you say, oh, I'm standing at this point, which way does the gradient point? Well, it points exactly to the minimum, the point that we're trying to find. So you might get there in one step, and then you're very happy. Whereas by contrast, if you have these oblong isocontours, and suppose you're standing right here, which way does your gradient point? It points this way. That's not even close to pointing towards the center of the ellipse. And in higher dimensions, this just gets a lot worse. All right, so we can center the data, but that only affects the first layer of hidden units. You can also think about how the outputs of the hidden units are centered. One thing I want to point out here is that our classic sigmoid curve, aka logistic curve, doesn't range from -1 to 1, it ranges from 0 to 1. So it is not centered on 0, it is centered on 1/2. You know, half the time it's above 1/2, half the time it's below 1/2. Given the principle I've just told you that we want neurons to function in the most nonlinear region of their nonlinear curve, it makes sense that we would want the average output of a unit to be 0 as well, at least with sigmoids. So it is common in practice to replace sigmoids with something that's basically just like a sigmoid, except it goes from -1 to 1 at the output, instead of going from 0 to 1. And that thing that people use is the hyperbolic tangent function. If you haven't seen that before, it's sort of a tangent-like function, except it's defined in terms of exponentials. Oops, that's wrong. It's e to the gamma minus e to the minus gamma divided by e to the gamma plus e to the minus gamma. And this is actually really closely related to the logistic function, aka the sigmoid, because really what we're just doing is essentially scaling the input by 2, then we're subtracting 1 so that it will be centered around 0, like I said we want it to be, and then multiplying by 2 again. And this will come up in homework 6, so you'll be a little bit more familiar with it. But main point here is just that instead of having something that goes from 0 to 1, now we have something that goes from -1 to 1. By the way, if you decide to use hyperbolic tangent units instead of sigmoids, then you need to change backprop, of course, because the gradient S prime gets replaced with the derivative of the tan h function. Another thing that people apply sometimes is the idea of using different learning rate or different layers of weights. And this idea is based on the observation that one of the properties of backpropagation with sigmoid units is that as you backprop the partial derivatives through your network, you find that at every layer of the network, the derivatives seem to be getting smaller and smaller. Like the partial derivative with respect to any particular weight gets smaller. And so that means that often early layers learn more slowly than layers near the output. Because when you do the partial derivatives, the gradients are smaller. So one thing you can do is try to make up for that with a larger learning rate. Here's a little figure that sort of tries to encapsulate this idea, maybe in a slightly more memorable way. The way you're supposed to read this figure is that the inputs are at the bottom, the output units are at the top, and on the left, well, so here we're seeing, here's a layer of weights, here's a layer of weights, here's a layer of weights, 3 layers of weights, 2 hidden layers of units. And on the left, we see within each layer of weights, maybe the functions look like that, so their partial derivatives are really big. Here, they're not as big, so their partial derivatives are not as big. Here, they're even smaller. As you backprop through the network, the derivatives get smaller and smaller. Why not compensate for it by just having a different learning rate in each layer? Again, you would pick these empirically. These are essentially hyperparameters. Well, they're sort of hyperparameters because they don't really negotiate the curve between overfitting and underfitting, between bias and variance. Rather, they negotiate how fast your algorithm is, your training. Any questions about that? Yeah. Why are the derivatives smaller as you go backwards? Well, for instance, I mean, a complete answer would require working fully through the backprop math. But remember, for instance, that if we use a sigmoid function, how does S prime behave? Well, it goes from 0 up to a maximum of 0.25. So every time you backprop through a layer, you're multiplying by a quarter. That's not the only thing that's going on. It's really more complicated than that, but that's one of the effects that you'll see. Another simple idea is called emphasizing schemes. So here the observation is that neural networks learn the most redundant examples pretty quickly, but if some examples are rare, they learn them very slowly. Like, suppose you're trying to design a neural network to diagnose a disease, and the disease is very rare, and 99% of your training points are people who don't have the disease, and 1% is people who do. Well, your neural network, or any classification algorithm, can just always say no. No, this patient's not sick. No, this patient's not sick. And have a 99% success rate in training. But that's not what we want. We want something that's sensitive enough to pick out those 1% of people who have the rare disease in our diagnosis group. And so let's emphasize them. Let's train our neural network in such a way that the ones in the rare classes have are more weight on the algorithm. And there are several ways to do that. One way you can do that is just by presenting examples from rare classes more often, which is particularly easy to do when you're doing stochastic gradient descent. Alternatively, you could present them equally often, but you could use a bigger learning rate for the rare examples than the common examples. So in my rare disease example, what you could do is you could train your neural network with stochastic gradient descent, where you alternate between here's a training point that has the disease, here's a training point that doesn't have the disease, here's a training point that has the disease, here's one that doesn't. About a 50-50 split. Of course, your data does not have a 50-50 split. That means you have to reuse the people who do have the rare disease over and over again, but that's okay. That's what emphasizing is. Yeah? Messing with the what? Oh, yeah. This is very much a way of trying to simulate messing with the prior probability. Now, some emphasizing schemes also use this idea for misclassified examples. So the idea is once you've done some training, some epochs, you stop and you say, okay, which of my training set points are still being misclassified by the neural network? Well, maybe I'll emphasize those more. Now, the caveat to that is that you have to have examples that you trust. So overemphasizing points that the network is having trouble learning, is it having trouble learning them just because it's harder to learn those points, or is it having trouble learning them because the points actually have the wrong label? It is very common when we train classifiers that some of the data is wrong, that some of the labels are data entry errors or whatever. So you have to ask yourself before you do that, how much do I trust those points? If I trust them, yeah, then emphasizing the examples that are still misclassified can be very powerful. And if I don't trust them, maybe I shouldn't do this. All right, second order optimization is a term that refers to, let's try to look at the curvature data. We're not just going to look at the gradients and do gradient descent. We're also going to look at the second derivatives, the Hessian matrices or whatever, and try to figure out how to use curvature information to get to the solution faster. Newton's algorithm, which I taught you for logistic regression, is an example of a second order method. It actually computes the Hessian and uses the Hessian to get to the bottom faster. Unfortunately, Newton's method is generally completely impractical in neural networks because there's too many weights. If you have 10,000 weights, then the Hessian's going to be 10,000 by 10,000. And it's not worth the cost of working with that. Stochastic gradient descent will be faster. Also, neural network cost functions tend to be pretty complicated. So where Newton's method works really well with certain nice, smooth, convex functions, it's a little sketchier about how far downhill it will get you with a neural network cost function. However, there have been a lot of attempts over the years to try to incorporate curvature in less expensive ways into neural network learning. And, well, none of them are popular yet. I think none of them have really succeeded in a general way, but there are a few that have niches where they work well. So an old method that originates before neural networks is called the nonlinear conjugate gradient method, which extracts curvature information without actually computing Hessians or curvatures directly at all. And it has been found to work well for small networks, meaning not deep networks used for vision or anything like that, just the ones with a few layers. And small data and regression. And when I say and, I mean if you satisfy all three of those conditions, it's a good candidate for a nonlinear conjugate gradient method. If you only satisfy one of them, maybe not. I have to warn you that the nonlinear gradient method does not have a stochastic version. It is inherently a batch descent algorithm. So if you have huge data sets with lots of redundancy, it's not going to be able to exploit that redundancy. The other second order optimization algorithm that I've heard of that seems to claim surprisingly good results is called the stochastic Levenberg-Marquardt algorithm. Which does try to sort of approximate the Hessian, but not the whole Hessian, just the diagonal of the Hessian matrix. And the authors of the paper on this claim that convergence is typically about 3 times faster than a well-tuned stochastic gradient descent method. But the algorithm is pretty complicated. So I am giving these to you so that if you want to know more, you can look them up. And in that line, there are also some simpler acceleration schemes that you might also want to look up. These ones are actually a lot easier to implement than the ones I just mentioned. So they are actually pretty popular in practice. And they go by names like RMS prop, Atom, and AMS grad. There's a whole raft of these acceleration schemes, though I would say that Atom is one that has been a survivor. People continue to use it even years after it was invented, so maybe it's one of the best places to start. So these are all ways that try to solve the problem that gradient descent isn't very good because the gradients usually don't point in the best direction. I mean, you do want to do descent, you want to walk downhill, but the direction of steepest descent is rarely the best downhill direction. And so these are methods that try to find better directions and incorporate a little bit of curvature information, but not too much. That's all I'm going to say about those, except that they're really cool and well worth studying. But let me go on to something simpler. Here's something where I can kind of describe the whole algorithm. So one of the earliest ideas for improving neural network training was momentum. It's a very simple idea where as you iterate, I mean, normally when you do an iteration of basic gradient descent, each iteration has nothing to do with the previous iteration. You only look at where am I now, that tells me what direction to walk in. Whereas with momentum, the idea is now I'm going to remember what my velocity was during the last iteration and keep most of that velocity in this iteration. I will update my velocity in response to the new training point, but I will also continue moving more or less in the direction I was already moving. So here we sort of have an idea that you are moving with a certain velocity, and that velocity cannot change on a dime, it changes slowly. You have to apply force to make the velocity change. And so, expressed as pseudocode, let's start with one step of gradient descent. So this is our usual gradient descent rule. You'll recall the direction that we're going to move, delta W, is minus the step size times the direction of steepest ascent. You take one step where you move a displacement of delta W, and then from then on, we're going to have a loop where we continually take a step, and then after we take a step, we update the velocity which we were moving, or we update this next step that we're going to take. And so the idea of momentum is that the velocity at the next step is going to be a combination of the direction of steepest descent and the velocity that we were already moving at. So this second term essentially is conservation of momentum. Let's keep moving in the same direction, sort of. So this idea of momentum has been used successfully with both batch and stochastic gradient descent. The most crucial decision you have to make is the choice of this hyperparameter beta. Now, beta is always less than 1, and beta is the hyperparameter that specifies how much velocity persists from iteration to iteration. Unfortunately, I've seen conflicting information on what is a good way to choose beta. Some researchers set it to 0.9. Some researchers set it close to 0. Jeff Hinton, who's a famous deep learning researcher, suggests starting at 0.5 and slowly increasing it to 0.9 or higher as the gradients get smaller and smaller. One thing I'll mention is that if beta is large, then you probably need to choose epsilon a little smaller to compensate so that you're not getting crazy large movements. Also, the epsilon here does not need to be the same as the epsilon at the beginning. If beta is large, it makes sense to make this epsilon small to compensate for the large beta, but the initial epsilon, when you first get started, that can still be big. Now, one problem with momentum is that as you start to get close to a good minimum, you're liable to overshoot the minimum. So the thing about momentum is, you're working towards the center of your objective function, towards the minimum, and then when you get there, you keep going because you've got momentum. And it takes a little time to sort of turn around and go back again, and then you overshoot again, and you oscillate around the mean. So that's a disadvantage, but at least you made it close to the minimum in the first place. So there's a trade-off there. Any questions about momentum? Mm-hmm. Are we putting a lot of trust on the gradients that we find in the early stages? Yeah, I don't think that's really what's happening. Let me give a sort of example that maybe clarifies what momentum gives you. All right, suppose that I have a very oblong curve like this, and I don't use momentum. I'm liable to sort of zigzag back and forth and take a long time to get there because I'm zigzagging. Now suppose I do the same thing with momentum. Well, maybe the first step is the same, but the second step has some of the first step in it. The third step has some of the first two steps in it. And notice that my moves are getting more and more horizontal as I go, because although half the steps go up and half the steps go down, all of the steps are going to the right. So momentum remembers that all the steps are going to the right and says, oh, I should move more to the right. And in this example, it succeeds. It gets you to the center of this, or gets you to the minimum of this objective function faster. Mm-hmm. Should you change the momentum on whether the cost increases or decreases? Maybe. I would say that somebody's probably tried that. There are like literally a million different hacks you can think of in neural networks, and quite a few of them work. So I don't know about that one in particular, but it wouldn't surprise me. So there's actually a huge research literature on how to speed up neural network training, though it's always hard to figure out which stuff has actually been most successful. But I just gave you a small sampling of some of the ideas from that literature. And what I want to talk about next is not the speed of training, but the fact that neural networks can overfit, just like most machine learning algorithms can overfit your data if you're not careful. And if you do think you're overfitting, if you think you have low bias but very high variance, what can you do about it? There's a number of things. One thing is getting the number of hidden units per layer right is important. This is something you have to play with. Unfortunately, I cannot give you a simple formula for how many hidden units should be in each hidden layer. And there is a very strange phenomenon called double descent that has been the subject of a lot of research lately, where what people noticed is when they train very large neural networks, especially ones with wide layers, something strange happens. So suppose the x-axis here is the number of weights, or perhaps the number of weights per hidden layer. So how many units you have in a layer. And the y-axis is, say, the training risk, or the training cost function. What people will notice is that as the number of weights increase, you see the usual reduction in I said this wrong. This is not training cost. This is test or validation cost. All right, so as the number of units increases, as the number of parameters increases, as you would expect, bias goes down and the test error goes down. But over time, the variance starts to rise, even as the bias is still declining. And so you get the usual U-shaped curve of underfitting versus overfitting, bias versus variance. But then something really weird happens. When you reach the point where training error is 0, training cost actually is 0. So at this point, you have added so many parameters to your neural network that it can interpolate the data, meaning that it can give you the exact correct solution for every training point. Once you hit that point and you continue increasing the number of weights, strangely, there is a second descent of the test cost that is often observed in practice. And this bizarre phenomenon is called double descent. And I think people are still trying to understand it. It's partially understood, but definitely a grad research topic still. So there is a relationship between hidden units and overfitting, but it's not one that's easy to characterize. Neural networks are kind of crazy. But let me tell you some other things to think about while you're trying to avoid overfitting. So one of the techniques that we've learned this semester to avoid overfitting is ensembles. So instead of training one neural network, train 10 or 100 neural networks, and with each neural network use bagging. Also, just to throw in a little more randomness, let's make each neural network start with different random initial weights. Random initial weights by themselves don't always change what neural network you get, but it can't hurt. If you want to get a little fancier, you could actually change the architecture of each neural network as well, the number of hidden units, etc. But anyway, we saw how well ensembles work for decision trees. They work for neural networks too sometimes. And the obvious disadvantage here is, well, you know ensembles are slow. And guess what? Neural networks are slow. So ensembles of neural networks are really slow, which is why this isn't done that often. Something that is done a little bit more often is L2 regularization, just like in ridge regression. For exactly the same reason we do it in ridge regression. We tend to believe that large weights are less trustworthy than small ones, so let's try to prevent weights from getting gratuitously large. And L2 regularization is also often referred to as weight decay in the neural network literature and in the gradient descent literature for reasons I'll show you shortly. But first, here's the idea. We're going to just take the neural network cost function, and we're going to add an L2 regularization term. Or if you're doing stochastic gradient descent, we add that to the loss function of the particular training point we're descending on. Now here that W is a vector that represents all of the weights, all of the parameters in my neural network, in all the different weight matrices. And so we're just going to uniformly treat them all the same and add this to the gradient. And then when you do, I should say, always there's the question of whether you should include the bias terms in here. When I was talking about linear regression, I suggested that you probably should not penalize the bias terms. In neural networks, it's less obvious because remember what I said about neural networks, like units work best when they're in the middle of their nonlinear range. That's where they have the most power. Well, if you penalize the bias term, that tends to push the neuron closer to the center of its operating region. And so that might help, or it might not. As always, use validation to decide whether it's better to penalize those terms or not. Now, the effect of adding this term here to the cost function is as if to add to each step, when you take a step of gradient descent, each wi is going to change by, well, remember it's minus epsilon partial derivative of the cost function with respect to weight I. That will have an extra term on it now, added to the end. And that extra term is minus 2 epsilon lambda wi. We get that, just by taking the partial derivative of this with respect to wi. And multiplying by minus the step size. So when you do that, what that does to the weight is that if the weight is not being reinforced by learning, then it just decays on every iteration by a factor of 1 minus 2 epsilon lambda. So if you don't take into account the rest of the cost function, every weight is just decaying by a little factor, slowly exponentially decaying away to 0. And the only thing that stops all the weights from going to 0 is the fact that you're still training on real examples. So this decay happens if not reinforced by training, but of course you will still be reinforcing this by training. And that's why it's called weight decay. There is an example in one of your textbooks, the ESL, Elements of Statistical Learning, that I will show you the difference between using weight decay and not using weight decay in a neural network in one of their classification problems with artificial data that the authors have cooked up. Since they're using synthetic data, they know what the correct Bayes decision boundary is. So those purple dashed lines you see here are the correct Bayes decision boundary between the blue points and the brown points. The actual decision boundaries found by the neural network are here in black. And the main difference between these two plots is that the one on the left has no weight decay. The one on the right has weight decay, or L2 regularization. And I would judge that in this case, the one on the right definitely is closer to the Bayes optimal decision boundary than the one on the left. So here's an example with actually training the neural network to see what happens. And in this case, it worked out pretty well. I can't promise it will always work out that well, but it's worth it sometimes. Any questions about weight decay and L2 regularization? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, lambda is yet another hyperparameter. Sometimes the right hyperparameter setting is 0, but you tune it the same way you tune any other hyperparameter. And this is a hyperparameter that does affect the bias variance trade-off. So the standard ways we've learned in this class work well there. All right, I saved the craziest idea for last. It's called dropout. Dropout is really interesting for a number of reasons. It emulates an ensemble, albeit without having an ensemble, without the expense of an ensemble. You just have one neural network, but you get some of the results you would get from an ensemble, and here's how that works. What we're going to do is we're going to at different times in training, we are going to disable some of the units in the neural network. So on the top, what you see is a neural network topology where the inputs are on the left and the outputs are on the right. So what they're doing to train this network is, maybe for the first epoch or 3, they are literally disabling a bunch of units and saying, we're just going to treat those as if the weights in and out, are 0, or the activations are 0. We're going to do forward propagation with the surviving units and back prop through the surviving units and update the surviving edges with the weights that back prop tells us to use. And we'll do that for an epoch or 3. And then when we're done that, well, now we're going to do it again, but this time we're going to choose a completely different set of random units to disable and iterate again. And so the idea is that the neural network, in order to learn, has to kind of learn things in multiple ways. It has to learn it in such a way that when you disable some of the units, it still gives you the right answer a lot of the time. The authors suggest that the hidden units should be disabled with probability 0.5. The input units, they disable those with a smaller probability. And do stochastic gradient descent, frequently change which units are disabled. The authors claim that this method gives better generalization than L2 regularization. And you can see why it acts like an ensemble. Every few minutes you have a different neural network, even though it's the same neural network. And so, but it's a lot faster to train than a whole ensemble of neural networks. So at this point, I want to remind you, last lecture on Monday, I told you about Carl Lashley's rat experiments, where he tried to make a rat forget how to run a maze by introducing lesions into its brain. And he was never able to make them forget how to run a maze. If you want to train a neural network to have the same property, this is a way to do it, because this is literally a neural network where if you cut out half the hidden units, it still knows how to run the maze. So dropout is really a good way to duplicate that effect of the brain in neural networks. Yes? Sorry, network proving? Pruning, oh. Well, I have not seen anybody use pruning to improve or to reduce overfitting. I've seen pruning used as a way of making neural networks more compact so that they can fit in a smaller memory. But I'm not sure what research you're referring to. Mm. Oh. Ah, okay. Well, one thing I should say is that when you finish training this neural network, you turn all the neurons back on. They're all running. And when you do classification, you use all of them. So they find that by doing so, you're going to get a better network, like better test error, than what you would have had through just pruning away some of the neurons. That's their claim. Mm-hmm. If you need to calculate the gradient for the what? Well, you definitely need to recompute the gradient from scratch every time you change which neurons you are disabling and which ones you're allowing to run. It's a relatively simple process, but you do have to sort of work it out on paper how to do it. Yes, you need to calculate the gradient just like normal, except you are literally ignoring all of the edges that are disabled. Assume the value is 0? We do not calculate a gradient at all for the edges that are attached to disabled neurons. So all of those edges are, the weights, we are not going to change the weights on those edges while those neurons are disabled. Oh, during backprop? No, no information passes through those edges during backprop either. So we want to make sure that what we're propagating is the gradient of the same thing we're forward propagating now. Yeah. Well, it's throughout training. All times during training, you're disabling some of the neurons. Whenever you want to. You train, so you could do one epoch with these neurons, and then you can change which ones you're disabling and do a second epoch. Change them again, do a third epoch. Now, depending on how much data you have, it might make sense to change the disabled neurons more often than once per epoch, or maybe less often. It really depends on your data size. Yeah, absolutely. The cost function is changing every time you disable neurons. Absolutely, that's true. That doesn't stop this method from working, though. Well, yes and no. I mean, when you disable some of the neurons, you're getting a cost function that approximates the true cost function of the final circuit that you're going to use to classify. So I can see why that's a bit confusing. I mean, I'm giving you a very shallow introduction to a very deep topic, and so I don't think, you're not going to understand what's really going on here until you read the paper, is the bottom line. So this is more to tell you that there's something really cool that you should learn about than to try to give you many details about it, because I have to leave out a whole lecture or two worth of details, sorry. Mm-hmm. Do you what? No, when you are predicting on the test data, no longer do you disable any neurons. So disabling neurons is for the training phase only. When the training phase ends, we enable all the neurons and use the full network to classify. It is time for a change to our final neural network topic, which is convolutional neural networks. Of course, that is a lot of syllables, so we tend to abbreviate them. Sometimes they're called convnets. More often, I guess, they're called CNNs. No relation to the news. And these have been a big deal because they are a big part of the reason why interest in neural networks was inspired so heavily about 12 or 15 years ago. Often you will hear people talk about deep learning, and deep learning refers to neural networks with many, many layers. And it happens that these days all the best image recognition networks are deep and they are convolutional. Moreover, this topic won a big prize recently because 5 years ago, in 2018, the Association for Computing Machinery gave the Alan M. Turing Award, which is sometimes considered to be like the Nobel Prize of Computer Science, to Jeff Hinton, Yann LeCun, and Yoshua Bengio for their work on deep neural networks. So what we're about to see has had a huge impact. And it is most easy to understand what it's doing and why it's popular in vision problems, where the inputs are large images. And to illustrate the problem, suppose that we are trying to recognize what objects are in a 200 by 200 image. And I realize that 200 by 200 actually is not large by modern standards, but it's large enough to illustrate that we already start to have problems if we try to use a fully connected neural network to deal with that 40,000 pixel input. Because let's suppose that we try to process this in the natural way by connecting those 40,000 input units to the next layer of 40,000 hidden units. Well, if you have a fully connected network, so every input unit is connected to every hidden unit in the first layer of hidden units, that is 1.6 billion connections just in your first layer. That's too much. That's just hard to work with. So as a general rule, and especially for when we have large inputs like big images, neural nets are often over-parameterized. Meaning they just have too many weights and not enough data to deal with that, not enough data to train those weights properly. So the old school rule of thumb was that if you have way too many weights, then you want way too much data to train those many, many weights. And that's a rough, good rule of thumb, though I did tell you about this phenomenon of double descent. And what double descent tells us is that sometimes over-parameterization is good. It actually can lead to good test errors or test accuracy. But the bigger problem is just the amount of time it takes to deal with a network with a billion weights. That makes the network very, very slow to train, even kind of slow just to use it to classify things. We would like not to have 1.6 billion weights that we have to do math on just to classify one image. All right, so researchers address these problems by taking inspiration from the neurology of our visual system in the back of our heads. Remember early this semester, I think lecture 4, I told you guys that you can get better performance on the digit recognition task if you use edge detectors. Now, edge detectors have a couple of interesting properties. One is that each edge detector just looks at a tiny piece of the image and says, is there an edge in this little 5 by 5 or 7 by 7 square? And second, edge detection is the same no matter what part of the image you're looking at. So you look over here, if there's an edge, recognizing that edge is exactly the same computation as recognizing if there's an edge over there. Let's apply these two ideas, these two properties, to neural network design. So the ideas, the main driving ideas in convolutional neural networks are, first of all, local connectivity, which means a hidden unit. I have to be careful here. Really, a hidden unit in the early layers. In the late hidden layers, we're still going to use fully connected usually, but in the early layers of the network, a hidden unit will connect only to a small number of units in the previous layer. And that small collection of units in the previous layer I'm going to call a patch, because it's usually a little square piece of our image. So what this means is we're not fully connected. A hidden unit is not connected to all the units in the previous layer, just a few of them. That's going to save us a lot of edges and a lot of time. It also, improves the over-parameterization problem. The second idea is shared weights. So what that means is that we're going to have groups of hidden units that instead of each one having its own little bunch of weights, they're all going to share one little bunch of weights, and all these different hidden units are going to use the same small set of input weights. So this set of input weights is called a mask, or well, it goes by multiple names in the literature. There's not much consistency. Sometimes it's called a filter. In fact, in homework 6, you'll see it's called a filter. Sometimes it's called a kernel. But there's no relationship at all to the kernels I taught you a few weeks ago in Lecture 16. This is an entirely different thing that just happens to be called a kernel. All right, so we are going to learn several masks, and we're going to apply those masks at many different places in the same image. And so you can think of a mask as something that might turn into an edge detector, for instance, or it might detect something else equally important. So each mask is going to operate on every patch of an image. We kind of cut an image into patches, or the patches may be overlapping, but anyway, we're going to learn a certain number of masks. Each mask is going to be applied to every patch of the input image. I'll show you visually what those look like later, but for now, let's just get the concepts down. And so the number of masks times the number of patches will give you the number of hidden units in the first layer of hidden units. Now, the nice idea here is that since we're applying the same mask to many different spots on our image, if one of those masks learns to detect edges, then suddenly we know how to detect edges everywhere in the image. In other words, every patch has an edge detector. So you're not just learning the edge detector in one spot, you're learning it everywhere. Because the mask that recognizes edges is applied all over the image to every patch. So what's happening here, sort of a higher level point of view on this, is that convolutional neural networks are exploiting repeated structure that occurs in things such as images, also other domains like audio. So you can do a lot of speech processing just by looking at short snippets of audio and applying masks to those as well. Now the word convolution, as we use it here, essentially means that we take a certain linear transformation and we apply that same linear transformation to many different patches in our image by shifting the patches around or by shifting the mask around. So that's what shared weights are about. Shared weights reduce the total number of weights. So they are another way of dealing with overparameterization, bringing the number of parameters down. And so you can think of them as a kind of regularization. But shared weights have another big advantage, independent of that. Suppose that you're running gradient descent, and one of the masks starts to develop an edge detector. Well, that edge detector is being trained on every part of every image, not just on one little spot in every image. And that's good because edges can appear at many different locations in your photographs. And by learning from all of those, an edge detector can learn more quickly. The location of the edge in the photograph no longer matters. Another point I want to make is that in neural networks, we can think of hidden units as features like we introduced in just back in Lecture 4. But they are features that you don't have to hand code. They are features that the learning algorithm learns for you. Well, convolutional neural networks take that idea to the next level by learning features from multiple patches simultaneously, and then applying those features everywhere, not just in the patches that they were learned from. I'm going to talk a little bit about the connections between these and what we know about neurology of the visual cortex. And one thing I want to say about that is that local connectivity is an idea directly inspired by our visual cortex. But shared weights obviously are not biological. This is not something that happens in the human brain. So there the analogy breaks down. All right. So I don't usually like slides, but I'm going to show some because for what I'm about to talk about, it's by far the easiest way to get the ideas across. So this is a picture of some neurons, the black bodies, and a needle poking into one of them because neuroscientists can stick needles into individual neurons and actually measure the action potentials. Now, after a few hours of that, the neuron dies, but before it dies, you can learn a lot about neurology that way. By doing this, biologists very quickly learned how some of the neurons in the retina, called retinal ganglion cells, respond to light. So in this diagram here, starting on the left in blue, those are the cells in your retina that actually sense light directly. That information gets passed along to the right and reaches these pink cells on the right called retinal ganglion cells. The retinal ganglion cells have very interesting receptive fields. So illustrated here, the idea here is that if you take a light and focus it on a very small region of the retina, and that happens to be the region that this particular retinal ganglion cell is sensitive to, then it will cause that cell to fire. So this on the right is the action potentials being fired by this retinal ganglion cell over time. Each of those vertical bars is a spike, an action potential. Yeah? I'm not sure what you mean. I mean, someone has stuck a needle in a retinal ganglion cell and is just measuring the voltage. Yeah. Now, if you make that light shine a little bit wider so that it covers more of that positive area that the retinal ganglion cell is sensitive to, then you get even faster action potentials. The retinal ganglion cell is even more excited. However, if you continue to widen that beam, now we start to encroach into the negative region there, which is where the retinal cells have an inhibitory effect on this particular ganglion cell. And so as the beam gets wider, the ganglion cell slows down. You get fewer action potentials. And as it gets wider still, you get even fewer action potentials. So this retinal ganglion cell is really designed to see a small white spot on a black background. That is what it's designed for. And if the spot gets too big, it's not as sensitive to it. You also have retinal ganglion cells that, well, sorry, before I say that. Yeah, so this is showing you the receptive field. Some retinal cells in the middle cause this ganglion cell to fire. Some retinal cells around it are inhibitory and try to stop it from firing. But you'll also find ganglion cells that are essentially the reverse of this, where the excitatory region in the middle and the inhibitory region around it get swapped. So now the inhibitory region is in the middle. And so now this will give you a ganglion cell that responds to a dark spot against a bright background. All right, so you've got these retinal ganglion cells, and these connections going off to the bottom right of this slide, those continue up into the V1 visual cortex in the back of your head. So on the right side of this diagram, you can see that's where the V1 visual cortex is, in the occipital lobe of your brain, at the back of your skull. These V1 cells prove to be a lot harder to understand than the ganglion cells. There was a famous experiment done by these two researchers, David Hubel and Thorsten Wiesel, at Johns Hopkins University. What they did is they put probes into the V1 visual cortex of cats. And when they were doing that, though, they had a very hard time getting those cells to fire. But a lucky accident unlocked the secret and ultimately won them the Nobel Prize in Physiology in 1981. And
the researchers actually listened in to individual nerve cells firing in the anesthetized cat as they presented it with different visual images.
When we started working, Thorsten and I, in the late 50s, we set up our first experiments, and they didn't go well because at the beginning we couldn't make the cells fire at all. We'd shine lights all over the screen, and nothing seemed to work. And rather by accident, one day, we were shining small spots, either white spots or black spots, onto the screen, and we found that the black dot seemed to be working in a way that at first we couldn't understand until we found that it was the process of slipping the piece of glass into the projector, which swept a line, a very faint, precise, narrow line across the retina. And every time we did that, we'd get a response.